A number of meat processing plants are facing backlash over their handling of the pandemic. Several facilities across the U.S. have become hotspots for the coronavirus. Now, union leaders and health officials are claiming some plant employees were required to show up for work despite testing positive for COVID-19. A Washington Post investigation found 3 of the country's largest meat processors have failed to follow safety protocols, including providing employees with proper protective gear. Taylor Teleford is one of the reporters of that article and joins me now. Taylor, what alleged violations by these processing plants really stand out to you the most?
Sure. So I think for starters, it should be said that these plants are places that were likely to experience some kind of outbreak anyway. These workers are in extremely close quarters. They're doing fast-paced work where they're often standing side by side to one another on the processing line. And if they're not side by side on the processing line, then they are often in crowded break rooms or in crowded restrooms or changing. But with that said, a lot of these companies failed to provide adequate personal protective equipment. They often overlooked or looked the other way when workers were showing up with positive temperatures and allowing them to work on the job after cooling off. And a lot of them have also not done an adequate job of giving employees information about outbreaks in their ranks. And so workers are knowing that people around them are getting sick, that they're being exposed to the virus, likely taking it home to their families, but they are not being told when they are coming into close contact with other people who have likely had it.
So what will happen to these companies, Taylor?
Well, based on the executive order that came out earlier this week, a lot of these companies are making the argument that they should be allowed to continue their operations without any kind of alteration. A lot of them have expressed major concern about the potential for food shortages and for struggles in the supply chain. But what that means for the workers is that they'll likely be put back in the situation where they're feeling called to show up for work by the federal government, despite having to work without adequate protections.
Yeah, and in your article, you point out that the processing capacity is already down 25%. It will be interesting to see how these companies now respond and how government watchers respond. You also found that some workers at distribution centers were afraid to touch product coming out of meat processing plants. Is there any reason that consumers should be concerned as well?
You know, at this point, the USDA and the FDA have been very adamant that it is not likely that the disease can be transmitted over surfaces like on packaging. But with that said, it hasn't been studied. So I think what's worrying those workers and what the public has a right to be worried by is the fact that we haven't really researched that enough to be able to say for certain that that's not possible. I spoke with a worker, actually 2 workers, who one actually lost her job after refusing to accept the shipment from the Sioux Falls plant, the Smithfield plant, which is now one of the biggest coronavirus hotspots in the country. And she was let go after she refused to receive it. And I spoke with another worker who experienced the same thing. Only difference is he decided to handle it because he wanted to keep his job.
But were there concerns, Taylor, about touching the meat product, or were there concerns about the general health and safety of the workers, given the lack of protective gear, the lack of cleaning, and the close proximity that some of them had to one another?
Definitely all of those are major concerns, but I think that the fact that these workers are afraid just to handle product probably goes to show how little information they're getting from these companies about the risks that they face just by showing up and doing their job every day. So in addition to not getting the adequate protections, that these companies do say that they've been following CDC and OSHA guidance since it was put in place in March. But with that said, most of our reporting in that story took place in early April, and workers told us repeatedly that they were not receiving adequate protective equipment, that there was not adequate social distancing happening inside the plants, and that they were being encouraged to show up even if they were sick.
Now, these were largely low-wage workers who are there on the front lines at the plants, many immigrants working there as well. Can you break down some of the health risks that this group in particular was facing and continue to face, really?
Sure. This is a particularly vulnerable group of workers, and the language barrier is a huge problem in terms of getting adequate information about the risks that they were facing. In many of these plants, it's common to have anywhere from 15 to 30 different languages spoken. But many workers across many different plants told us that information about the pandemic was only posted in English. And so English speaking workers feared for their colleagues, for their safety, of their coworkers that they knew didn't speak English. And some of them felt pressured to try and do what the company wasn't doing and warn them about the risks that they were facing. But some of them felt very helpless. And also, these are workers who are very unlikely to make the choice to miss a paycheck because of their own safety, because they're often supporting people back home, and they're under a lot of financial strain as it is. And so this is a particularly vulnerable group that is going to be very likely to continue to show up while they're sick and face risks and to have less information about their situation in general.
And Taylor, one last question to you. Is there any indication with your reporting shedding a light on this, with us talking about it, with union pressure, that these companies will now change their practices and make it safer, not just for the people working there, but also potentially for the consumers?
You know, these companies have repeatedly said that they've been adhering to all of the necessary guidance. But with that said, OSHA did put out fresh guidance just in the past week, specifically for meat packing and meat producing companies to take better steps to protect their workers in a way that's tailored to the industry. And so you hope that these things are going to change and that they're going to be getting the adequate personal protective equipment, that they're going to be seeing the kinds of social distancing that they want to be seeing. But to be perfectly honest, if the companies continue to prioritize production, it makes it pretty impossible to do the kind of things that they would need to do to stagger shifts more, to have fewer workers in the building at once. If they're going to continue prioritizing production, I think it's safe to say that these workers will continue to face risk.
Taylor Teleford, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.